Hi, my name is Henry Mooney. I'm an economics advisor with the Inter-American Development Bank, focusing on the Caribbean, and here for the tourism conference.
Henry, thanks for joining Breaking Travel News here at the conference in Kingston, Jamaica. You've just come off a panel. Please give us a bit of an overview of the key takeaways from that conversation.
Well, I think the conversation focused mostly on the COVID impact on the tourism industry in the Caribbean, how countries are recovering, and the prospects for the future. And I think that the takeaways really were that, the Caribbean, which is by our own measures, including the Tourism Dependency Index that we developed at the Inter-American Development Bank, the Caribbean is really the most tourism-dependent region in the world in terms of GDP, employment, exports, and the balance of payments. So it's no surprise that this region suffered more than almost any other when it comes to the impacts of COVID, when we saw about 70% of tourism flows dissipate in 2020 relative to the previous year. But the good news is that most countries in this region in particular have recovered very quickly. And Jamaica, for example, late last year and early this year, we're seeing numbers that look better than even the similar period in 2019. I think early after the crisis, most people didn't expect that recovery to happen so quickly. Our own forecasts then were that we wouldn't see these levels of tourism until 2024. So I think this gives us a lot of hope about sort of the near-term prospects. Now, we acknowledge there's lots of global factors that create uncertainty for demand, including economic performance in advanced economies, the war in Europe that is complicating travel. So there are lots of uncertainties and unknowns, but I think what we've seen so far is the Caribbean has been very resilient. And actually some of those factors, including people's aversion to travel, for example, from the US to Europe or further destinations given geopolitical issues, has actually caused them to look at the Caribbean more closely since it's a nearshore destination. So I think those are the key factors in the near term.
Really interesting. We're obviously here to talk about resilience, and you've also made a really interesting point through the index about dependency as well. So just give me a bit of a kind of an unpack on how those two words can coexist. How do you build resilience into an economy which is dependent on tourism?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think the answer is right there in the words that you said, right? Resilient dependence, to the extent that I think our index and many other measures show that this region actually has done something extraordinary in terms of the amount of global interest and demand it has generated in the tourism industry, which is why this country is vulnerable to shocks, but also sort of really has the opportunity to take more advantage of this unique quality that it has that draws people from all around the world to this region. I think what we learned from COVID and what we're thinking about more generally about natural disasters, because COVID was really a natural disaster, is that going forward the industry has to think harder about sort of making sure that not only its physical infrastructure is resilient to things like earthquakes and hurricanes, but also that the policies that it has, the relationships it has with governments are resilient to the kinds of things we saw during COVID, right? So making sure you're up to date on the latest health standards, that you're adaptable to sort of making sure that you're still marketable in shocks like that. So I think that that's one of the key issues. The other is sustainability in a more general sense. I mean, really these countries export sun and sand, right? So in order to keep that a competitive product, you have to make sure that you're environmentally conscious, right? That you're protecting your beaches, that you're protecting your natural habitat in a way that makes it viable for the long term. More generally, I mean, these countries are probably more aware than any in the world about climate change, right? And making sure that in the future, building power sources, the way of doing things, whether it's agricultural development, etc., are done in a sustainable way, because I think that's not only important for the industry, but it's important for everyone on the islands and important globally.
And when you think about sort of the proposition and tourism in this particular region, and how important is the kind of diversification in terms of products and proposition?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, diversification can mean many things, right? I mean, I think classically people have thought, well, these countries need to diversify away from tourism. I mean, obviously other sectors need to develop, that's crucially important. But as I said before, I personally think that they have a product that sells, right? They have something that's unique that can't be replicated in other parts of the world. So diversification of the tourism product and related industries, I think that's the key, right? And that's something that's very achievable. We were talking about this before. It could be developing the agricultural sector locally to support the tourism sector in a way that really hasn't been done before. I mean, the amount of food and drink imported into into Caribbean economies in particular, you could replace that with much of it anyway with local production, right? And you could do it in a sustainable way that will have its own sort of benefits, and maybe you could create scale to export it again, right? So I think these kinds of diversifications to other kinds of tourism, to higher value-added tourism, to services tourism like medical tourism, etc. I think these are the kinds of areas where you can really do a lot.
And you mentioned it there, critical to, alongside, I suppose, in a sense, exporting sun, sea, and sand, is service, right?
Yes.
And so, when we think about sort of the talent, and we think about kind of the human aspect of kind of creating that service and that experience, how do you build that in a sustainable way, a resilient way?
Well, I think that's a great point. I mean, again, part of it is the diversification, right? I mean, so services, tourism is definitely a service. I mean, as an economist, it looks like in the balance of payments, you account for it the same way you would export anything else. But there are all kinds of services that come with tourism, right? The cultural services, I'm talking about music, I'm talking about tourism around the island, not just sort of the traditional destinations, I'm talking about the things I mentioned before, right? So trying to create a broader sort of base of offerings in the tourism sector, in the services sector, I think that these can benefit each other, right? So I would say that that's it in one way. I think the other issue is skills development, right? I mean, not only creating up and downstream industries like agriculture, but you have, a third of the population in Jamaica, for example, is involved in one way or another in the services industry. They could be better trained, they could be better paid, they could be exported, right? And they could become entrepreneurs. So I think that's another area where, for sustainability and maximizing the benefits, there needs to be more focus.
And for readers and viewers of this interview, the index, how can they access it? Where can they find it?
Sure, it's called the Tourism Dependency Index. It's been published in many places. It's appeared in the Wall Street Journal, in the Economist magazine, and Reuters. But it's at iadb.org. Search for Tourism Dependency Index, and you'll be able to find it. And it's a great ranking. I think it's the only global ranking of its kind of 175 countries in the world, so pretty much every country in the world, on their dependence for tourism. And the index shows that countries in the Caribbean are really, 10 of the top 20 are in the Caribbean, and Latin America and the Caribbean more generally is probably the most tourism-dependent region of the world.
Henry, listen, thank you so much for sharing these fantastic insights with us today.
My pleasure.